Hello, oral historians, and welcome back. I am Summer Sherland, and today we are talking about indexing. So, you've spent the last couple of weeks researching a narrator. You've been looking into their lives, you've been asking questions about who they are, where they come from. You met with them, maybe your interview lasted about an hour. You recorded that interview, and since then, you have saved, uploaded, shared, or otherwise preserved that interview in an appropriate location and shared it with the people that need to have access to it, right? So you're done, right? Well, not necessarily. There are a couple things that make an oral history different from an interview. Let's say, in contrast, if you were a reporter for a newspaper or for an online magazine, you might spend a year reporting out on a story, right? So you're researching a story, you're interviewing people. Well, let's say that you interview a source who has a lot of information, right? There's someone who is very closely tied to that topic, and you meet him or her at a park. You spend a couple of weeks talking with them, and your interviews with this source might be longer than an hour. They might be several hours of data or content. Well, the difference between an oral historian's work and a reporter's work is that an oral historian is a shared author of the interview. So in fact, your narrator is considered the first author. They're actually the first author of that conversation. On the other side, the reporter in many ways owns that material once that interview has been completed. So they can do with that source what they like. That's why you see in movies where someone might say, on or off the record, right? If it's off the record, it means that can't be quoted back to that person. Well, in oral history is very different from that. The other thing that keeps an oral history separate from just a regular interview is the preserving and sharing process. What an oral history is made for is it's essentially becoming a primary source about a particular topic in question. And so part of your role as a historian is to create boundaries or parameters around that conversation so that future historians can look back on it, can research back on this particular topic and this particular person, and then cite you and your narrator, right? They actually cite you if they use this interview. So how to make that interview useful? I want you to pretend that several years from now, you are either getting a master's degree or a PhD in some sort of relevant field. You want to be a historian, or you want to be a sociologist or an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, or let's say you're just really interested in a specific kind of history and you want to hear personal testimony from people who lived during that time. Okay. Well, chances are you're not going to want to listen to hours of raw, unedited interviews conducted by students at the South Phoenix Oral History Project. No one really wants to sit through hours upon hours upon hours of these interviews. They might, I might, but not everybody. What our job now is to make this interview that you have created with your narrator useful and accessible to future researchers. And the way we do that is we actually create tags for moments in the interview that we think might be interesting or useful to people. There's a couple different ways that people use oral history and transform them into usable primary sources. The most common one is transcribing. Okay, let's say you're that researcher, right? You're getting your master's degree in history and you want to research incarceration, the history of incarceration in the Phoenix area. And you want perspectives from people who have experience with law enforcement, incarceration, et cetera, right? Well, instead of listening to hours and hours and hours of oral histories that usually might not even have anything to do with it, but maybe one person says one thing about this one thing regarding incarceration, instead of listening to that whole interview, what you'd be looking for is a transcript, which is the typing out of the interview itself. Here's the question, here's what the narrator said, here's the next question, here's what the narrator said. And usually those transcripts are available by PDF at most museums or libraries. A lot of times those transcriptions haven't been made public yet, so you have to go through a different process to request them. And a lot of times even still, those transcripts haven't even been created because transcription is a really arduous process. I'm a very fast typist. I can type really quick. And I would say an hour-long interview to transcribe it and transcribe it well would take me about 10 hours to do. And that's fast. I mean, there are professional organizations that we can hire out to transcribe your interviews. So you will not be doing a transcription for this class or for this project. You're going to be doing something else, something we think is more relevant to the work we do at the South Phoenix Oral History Project and the work that our students are doing. You're going to be creating an index, all right? You're going to be creating a way for future researchers to be pointed to moments in the interview that you think are relevant to that person's life, to the history of South Phoenix, and to the history of sort of global and local trends in both Phoenix and Arizona, as well as globally. So I'm going to show you how to do that today. The index is much less time consuming than a transcription, but it is a big part of the project. So you want to take it seriously and you want to allocate quite a bit of time towards this moment in your interview project, okay? So let's start with a final product so you can see what it is that we're looking for in the end. This is our website as of 2021. Every single one of our narrators, I'll go back to this page where it just says South Phoenix and South SMCC Memories. This is our signature collection of the South Phoenix Oral History Project. Every single one of the people we interview has a page written about them. Students primarily, like you, will write the story and identify moments in the interview that they think really illustrate this part of the story. And every single one of those people interviewed that's highlighted with an underline, those people have live pages. If you notice that some of them are grayed out or don't have an underline, that's because those pages are pending, meaning students are currently working on them or students will be working on them in the coming weeks or months. So here's a great example. This is a story and a web page written about Dr. Wilma Patterson. And when you're done with your project this semester, your page will look a lot like this. But today we're just doing one of those parts, and I'll show you which part. So Dr. Wilma Patterson, who was Professor Emerita of Biology at South Mountain Community College, we have a photograph of her here, and a story that students wrote about Dr. Patterson. But then you see we have little video clips embedded of Dr. Patterson talking about different parts of her experience. So let's watch this clip, and it's called Patterson W, because her first name starts with a W, 1525, working at South Mountain Community College.
Let me go back to my first days of when I got my master's at ASU in zoology. I was an adjunct at Mesa Community College, and I heard that they were going to put a college in South Phoenix. And I discussed with my husband. I said, you know, I would like to go down there to work. And you know what I found most interesting? I like the diversity because there was not that at Mesa. Again, you're alone. And when I came here, when the college first opened, I was absolutely thrilled to be in such a mix of people from different origins. There were the Hispanic students, there were the African Americans, there were the Caucasian students, and there were students from other countries and students from Honduras and Cuba, and we had a group from Ethiopia. What a rich environment to work in. South Mountain Community College had the diversity and the cultural mix that I wanted to be a part of. And believe it or not, after I came here, people would say, well, why do you want to go down there? I said, because that's where I belong. I belong at South Mountain Community College.
So you can see this is about a 2-minute long video. And how did we choose those 2 minutes? And why did we put those 2 minutes here placed in the story? Well, that is your job today. Your job is to identify different moments throughout the interview that you think are sort of clips or snippets of the interview that talk about one specific topic. So we wanted her perspective on working at South Mountain Community College. But later, we want to know about early South Mountain Community College. And she talks about it in a couple different ways. And we ask most of our narrators about their legacy or the legacy of the college. And so you can see throughout this hour-long interview, students have identified 4 different moments that they think are relevant enough to embed in our website in the story of Dr. Patterson. And I want to scroll down and just remind you of how this works, right? The students who interviewed her, Jean-Marc and Emmanuel, they're actually the students who also wrote the story and created the index. In some cases, you might be creating the index after students have already interviewed your person, and that's fine too, because we give you credit on either end. So for example, here's a story about Vanessa Logan. Vanessa Logan, who works in student services and student life on our campus. Again, we have a photo of Vanessa here, and you'll notice we don't have the videos created yet, but we do have future video clips. So we know we're going to put a video here of Vanessa Logan growing up in New York City. And again, I'll scroll to the bottom. You can see the metadata created. She was interviewed by Dr. Travis May, and the story was written by these 4 students. Or 3 students rather, right? No, 4 students. So her index and her story were written by 4 students. They aren't the same people who interviewed her. And that's okay. That's because this is a collaborative project. So how in the world to create your index? We're not talking about the story today. We're not talking about the website today. We're just creating the back end, the sort of the backstage. One day when I come in here and I'm looking at your website for the narrator you interviewed this semester or the narrator you studied this semester, you're not going to necessarily have all this laid out for me. I'm going to need to find throughout your interview the moments that I think matter. And moreover, even if it's not the story of your narrator, let's say, remember our documentary where we have the documentary on the history of South Phoenix? That documentary pulled moments from interviews that maybe aren't even identified on the web. So how did we find all that? The index, and the index is crucial. So I know I've done a lot of exposition today to talk to you about like kind of what you'll be doing, but the bulk of today's lab is how to do that. So I want to share with you this training guide, which is maybe 25 pages of different training materials that we use at the South Phoenix Oral History Project. And it's all the training that you may have taken. So if you've taken the context lab, if you've taken writing the questions lab, all of those materials are available on one link. And I will link to this in the YouTube show notes. But today we're going to focus on after the interviewing indexing. And throughout the rest of today's video, I will be asking you to pause and reflect or write on your own. So please be ready for that. In addition, you'll need some materials. You'll either need a computer with an open Word document, or you might need a piece of paper and a pen. I would use a Word document because you're going to probably be moving things around, but it's 100% up to you. So take a moment, scramble, go get your things, and we'll meet back here in just a moment. All right, are we ready? Great. So let's start here with part 1. One main difference between a basic interview and a formal oral history has to do with how you research, record, and process the interview. For the South Phoenix Oral History Project, we ask interviewers and students to index completed interviews instead of transcribing. So for part 1, my question for you is, what is indexing? I've given you some clues. I've talked about it at the beginning of the video, but you may have your own understanding. So on your own, pause the recording and brainstorm. What is an index and how do you use it? Welcome back. I wonder what you wrote. What is an index and how do you use it? The best way for me to describe it is almost like comparing it to a book. So this is Tom Sheridan's Arizona, which is the text that I use for for Arizona history in the class I teach at South Mountain Community College. Most books and all scholarly books have indexes. So let's go ahead and take a look at what Sheridan has. So this is his book. It is 485 pages long, okay? And in the back of it, starting on page 465, is an index, and everything's listed by alphabetical. So 20 pages of his nearly 500-page book is index. So let's say I want to look up South Phoenix. So I go to S. Okay, South Phoenix. Page 270 to 71. So now I know to go to page 270 to 271, where he will talk about South Phoenix. That is an index. That is the purpose of an index, is to direct your readers, or in our case, our listeners or our viewers, to here is an important topic in the interview, and here's where you can find it. That is an index, and that's how our readers and audience will use it. They will use it to find moments throughout the interview that they can then use for their own research, or that we can use for our own purposes. Okay, so that's how you use an index. Now, how do you create it? How do you take an hour-long interview and break it up into meaningful moments? So what I'm going to show you is from the OHM's database training website. I'm actually not going to show it on this YouTube. I'm going to link to it in the show notes. But there is the Louis B. Nunn Oral History Center has developed this really great metadata database that you can actually use with your own interviews. You don't have to, but people upload their own interviews into this database and it helps them index, right? So I'm going to have you watch this brief tutorial about a standard indexing process. And as you do, simply write things that come to mind, important key terms that seem to stick out to you about how to create an index. So go ahead and pause the tape. I'll link to this in the YouTube video so that you can find the recording on your own. Watch the tutorial done by the Louis B. Nunn Oral History Center and come back to me and we'll talk about it. All right, welcome back. So what were some of the buzzwords or important key terms that stuck out to you? Maybe you wrote down keywords or segment or timestamp, or maybe you wrote down important information or OHMs or metadata. Whatever you wrote down, that's good because it sort of generated some ideas in your mind as to what an index is and how you're going to create it. So just a refresher, indexing helps librarians, archivists, but also future researchers find important parts of your interview for their specific research. Indexes can be easily generated by researchers and students, so you can actually create this on your own. It's not like transcription, which requires some training and a significant amount of time and practice. Because transcripts, on the other hand, are word for word accounts documenting every single thing said in the interview. They're kind of akin to a legal transcription. So like an interview with a suspect, or a court transcription, something that's done in a very legal arena. Everything has to be word for word and almost word perfect. And it's very labor intensive to create. That's not what we're doing today. We're doing the index. So I'm gonna have you practice. In part 3, I'm going to have you brainstorm. Well, pause the tape again, brainstorm on your own, different moments or points of an index, what you think that definition is. You don't have to do an example quite yet, just sort of a different moment throughout the interview. So I'm going to say the word, I'm going to give you a moment to write down your own brainstorm, and then we'll move on. So there are, in this index, 6 different aspects of an index. And I'm having you brainstorm what that aspect is. Not an example, but what do you think that means? Okay, so first, title. What is the definition of a title inside an index? Not the title of a book, but the title of the actual moment in an index. And if I'm going too fast, you can pause and do this on your own. All right, next one, partial transcript. What do you think the definition of partial transcript is? And this is just brainstorming. We'll go back and I'll actually tell you what they are. Okay, next one, keywords and subjects. What's a keyword? What's a subject? What is that? Synopsis, hyperlinks, and GPS coordinates. What are those things? Not an example, but what are they? If you were describing to a friend over a cup of coffee and they said, what's a hyperlink? Tell them what a hyperlink is. What's a synopsis? Tell them what a synopsis is. All right, take a moment if you need to. Pause the video if you need, and we'll come right back in a moment. All right, I'm going to tell you my definitions now, and this is really where you should align whatever you guessed to what I'm telling you, because whatever you guessed is probably really close, but it may not be exactly what we're looking for. And because this is an assignment that you're doing on behalf of our project or as a part of a class, I want you to know exactly what I'm looking for so that I'm being transparent and my expectations. So let's start with title. For title, I'm not looking for the title of your interview. So I'm not looking for like Wilma Patterson, right? That's not the title of your segment. I'm actually looking for that moment, what you would call that moment. So I'm going to go back to Vanessa Logan's. And do you see here where we see future video clip growing up in NYC? That's the title of that segment, growing up in NYC. In that moment, Vanessa must be talking about growing up in New York City. Partial transcript. You don't have to type out the entire transcript of that moment itself, because you'll be transcribing the entire interview if you do that. Just maybe the first couple words of what it is your narrator said. So a lot of students use the question. They say, partial transcript is, what have you heard about the origins of South Mountain Community College, right? That's how, if I'm the indexer and I'm looking through your interview and I'm using your index and I'm looking through, a moment in your interview, that's how I know I've gotten to the right point. Okay, so, the title is The Origins of South Mountain Community College. The partial transcript is, what do you know about the origins of South Mountain Community College? I've found here at at minute 8:36 that the student asks Vanessa, what are the origins of South Mountain Community College, right? I triangulate those three things. Keywords or subjects. Now, this is where you get to have a lot of control, and I really want you to be thoughtful and sensitive as to what it is that you want to pull out of that interview. You may have seen in the OHMS training video that there's a difference between keywords and subjects. Keywords are things that your narrator says specifically, redlining, right? Or South Mountain Community College, or biology, right? Anything that they say within that transcript that's a keyword. Think of it as if I were to do a Google search of something and it pulls up everything that's in there. So just a keyword is like a tag or a comment. For this whole video, a keyword of this entire training that I'm doing for you right now would be indexing, right? I'm using that word a lot. So the keyword is what's pulling up. Subject is a little bit different. Subject is you, the researcher, putting kind of an umbrella over that moment. They may not ever actually say South Mountain Community College, but they might say the college, they might say the campus, they might say South Mountain, they might say SMCC, right? Those are keywords or topics, but they never actually said the word South Mountain Community College, but that's what they're talking about. So that's a subject. That's a generalization. That's the difference between keyword and subject. Keyword comes from the narrator's mouth for the most part. Subject comes from the researcher's standpoint. Sometimes they align just fine. And then I added these other two because this is all brought up in the OHMS video, and you may or may not think that this is useful as part of your index. These aspects are not required. I skipped. Oops. Synopsis. We'll go back to synopsis first. Synopsis is you, the researcher, telling us what is this clip or what is this segment about. So Wilma Patterson describes the origins of South Mountain Community College. So your title is The Origins of South Mountain Community College. The partial transcript is what were the origins of South Mountain Community College. The keywords are origins, South Mountain Community College, South Mountain, etc. Subject is, right? Sometimes these things overlap quite a bit. Synopsis, Wilma Patterson talks about the origins of South Mountain Community College. So it's you, the researcher, telling us what are these moments about? What's this moment about? Then the last two, hyperlinks. Only if necessary or useful, just as they point out in the training video, should you identify a hyperlink that can maybe pull the researcher to another website that helps them understand something. Same for GPS coordinates. If they bring up something like, let's say they talk about the petroglyphs up on South Mountain, up in the park, and they tell you a specific location where you can find them, maybe GPS coordinates there work. But it doesn't work for every single segment. So I'm going to have you try. Unlike before where I had you pause your video and go and look on your own at the OHMS training database, this one, because we own this clip, I'm going to show you and I'm going to have you try to index this segment. So remember, we're looking for title, partial transcript, keywords and subjects, synopsis, and if necessary, hyperlinks and GPS coordinates.
See, I want to be a teacher, and I changed my sites. I wanted to be a high school teacher, and then I realized I don't want to teach those kids. They're horrible. They don't listen to you. I want to deal with adults, so I altered my site. So when I graduated with my BA, I said, hey, to be a community college teacher, you have to have a master's. So I went after the master's. And then when I graduated with my master's, California in the 1970s had just passed a whole series of laws, those proposition, blah, blah, blah. And they were killing support for education. The community college in California was free. There was no tuition, it was free. And all of a sudden, there is tuition. So when I graduated with my master's, there were no jobs. There were no jobs. But I had teachers at the college I went to, well, for my graduate degree, who said, hey, why don't you just hang around and get a PhD? That was never my goal. There's no jobs. Maybe when you graduate in 2 years, there will be other jobs. I never wanted to teach at a university because at the university, it's publish or perish. That was not my goal. My goal was to teach, to be an instructor, a teacher, right?
Okay, so that clip was about 1:28 minutes. And now what I want you to do is go back and fill out, what would you call this segment? What's the title of this segment? What's the partial transcript? What was the first word? And you might have to go back, and I'll link this in the show notes. You might have to go back and hear the first words that he said. What were some of the keywords or subjects? And what's the synopsis of what he talked about? Hyperlinks and GPS coordinates are not super relevant with this particular segment. So go ahead and pause and come back when you're ready. All right, so welcome back. The title that the students who wrote this index gave it was Called to Teach, but you might have written a different title. Maybe your title said something about getting a PhD or higher education in California in the 1970s. Whatever you thought that title should be, what's he talking about? What's the title of that segment? That's probably what you wrote. If you were looking for a transcript or a partial transcript, I think he starts with the word C, ... right? He says C, and then he kind of goes into his description. So let's see what he says. Here's what you would write.
See, I want to be a teacher.
So the partial transcript to me is C, I want to be a teacher, or wanted to be a teacher. Either one of those. See, I wanted to be a teacher.
And I changed my sites. I wanted to be a high school teacher.
You don't need more than that. And I changed my sites. I wanted to be a high school teacher. So I would write, C, I wanted to be a teacher, and I changed my sites. I wanted to be a high school teacher. Keywords or subjects: higher education, history, teacher, California, 1970s. Any one of those keywords could work here. college, community college, universities, etc. Subjects would be similar. You're very close to all those subjects here. You don't necessarily need to add anything to that within the keywords for this index. Synopsis, what did you write? What did Dr. Morales talk about in this conversation, in this part of the conversation? And again, hyperlinks and GPS coordinates, not super relevant for this particular segment. So we're going to try one more, and I'm going to take a full interview and I'm going to show you how you're going to do the rest of it. So that's just like the content of your index, but there's a couple more requirements for our purposes in this particular assignment. This is the interview with Vanessa Logan, right? And as you can see down here where the timestamp is, her interview lasted 44 minutes and 54 seconds. So as you're creating an index, you're not just creating the content of each segment, you are also telling us where. Remember that index I showed you in the book? You're telling us where in the book, where in the interview does this conversation take place? So the other thing you need to create is a timestamp, and you have to be as precise as possible for the timestamp. Don't just say 5 minutes, because no segments are brought up that rigorously. This particular one I'm starting at, we're going to start at like 8. We'll start at like 8:27, right? And you're trying to find out where in this interview does this segment start. And I'm just going to play it and let you do this. So work on the timestamp for this particular moment.
So yes, but the payoff is not so much as back to me. The payoff is when I see, for example, a student that I help, to mentor, they graduate, they get their degrees, they come back, and then they do the same thing with other students. That's how you get the payback. It's more legacy than it is, hey, look what I did. It continues. The legacy continues.
Okay. Do you see how she pauses there? For me as a researcher, that's a moment where I think, ooh, we're coming up on a new segment, because she's shifting into a new topic. Here we go.
Do you know much about the origins of South Mountain Community College?
Well,
so that started at like 8:53, and the student says, do you know much about the origins of South Mountain Community College? That could be the beginning of this segment.
when I first started at South Mountain here in 2003, I worked.
Okay, so you can choose as the researcher, do you want to start this segment at the moment where the student asks the question, or do you want to start the student at the segment at the moment where Vanessa begins answering? It's up to you. You get to decide. I don't have a preference on that either way, but you do need to be precise, right? Because if your partial transcript doesn't line up with your timestamp, it really confuses me and other researchers quite a bit. Okay, so I'm talking about segments, I'm talking about timestamps, and you're at the point now where you kind of have an understanding of what information is required for each of these indexes. And so what I'm asking you now is to go through your interview. If you have a 45-minute interview to about an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 15, you should be identifying about 15 segments, right? 15 segments. Because if you think about it, you asked 15 questions. So there should be at least 15 different moments in the interview that are different from one another. 15 segments, and each should have a timestamp, where that segment begins, and all the other requirements here. What's the title of that segment? What's a partial transcript? What are the words that are said? What are some keywords or subjects? What's the general gist of that part of the conversation? And then you move on to your next one. If you want to include hyperlinks or GPS coordinates, that's completely up to you. Before I leave you, I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to show you what the students created on behalf of a previous interview that we conducted. Okay, I'm going to show you 2 different ways that students have created these indexes, and I might even show you a third. So this is an index created by Tony Bracamonte, who is someone students interviewed a few years ago. You can see they have a timestamp. They just have the beginning of each stamp. They don't have the full duration of the segment, and that's okay. They have a segment title for each of their 15 or more segments. They actually have quite a few. They have a synopsis. Okay, so introductions, synopsis, summary provides, that's me, an outlook on what the interview will be like, partial transcript. So this is where the faculty doing the interview with the students usually says, today's date, can we get your consent? So that's just like the beginning of the interview, but you can see as it goes in, the shift of the synopsis turns towards what the narrator is saying. So let's look at 608, changes in South Phoenix. So it's 6 minutes, 8 seconds. Tony explains how South Phoenix has changed over time through his perspective. The students titled that segment Changes in South Phoenix. Partial transcript is Tony says it's dramatic, and then he goes into something. And then keywords are subjects: farm worker director, baseline, orange groves, developed heavily minority area. Here's another example. This student chose to use Excel instead of Word document or a table, and that's fine as well. Same thing, they just did the beginning of each time. So at 40 seconds, at 4 minutes, 9 minutes, 11, 12, 19 minutes, 35 seconds, etc. And the title, the partial transcript, keywords, etc. I have one more I can show you because it's very different. These students just used a Word document. Timestamp is identified here, right? What time that segment begins. T is title, childhood challenges, partial transcripts, keywords, subjects, or synopsis rather. S is synopsis. They did use GPS coordinates for some of these as well. Okay, so for every interview you've been assigned, that's about an hour long, you should have 15 segments or so. If you have like 12 or 17, that's fine, however many you need, but you should have close to 15 because you've asked 15 questions, or your interviewers have asked about 15 questions. 15 segments, each with a timestamp and all of the following material that we've already covered in this class: title, partial transcript, keywords or subjects, synopsis, and the other two things if necessary only. All right, I'm going to link to all these materials in the show notes of both YouTube and our podcast. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. You can send an email to historysouthmountain@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me directly. Okay, good luck.